most people think agriculture was the greatest leap forward in human history. The moment we stopped wandering and started farming, and everything that followed: cities, civilization, the modern world. But two of the most widely read writers of the last 50 years looked at that story and called it a fraud. Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, one of the best-selling books of the last decade, called the agricultural revolution history's biggest fraud. Jared Diamond, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biologist, wrote an entire essay calling farming the worst mistake in the history of the human race. These aren't fringe thinkers. These are people whose books sit on the shelves of heads of state. So what did they see that we don't? For 200,000 years, people wandered in small groups, eating whatever they could find. Wild fruits, nuts, meat, roots, and they weren't miserable. Studies of hunter-gatherer groups found they worked maybe 15 hours a week to feed themselves. One man, when asked why he didn't try farming like the people nearby, said, "Why bother? There are plenty of nuts in the forest." Their diets were remarkably varied. A typical group ate over 100 different species of plants and animals, and because they kept moving, diseases couldn't spread. No dense settlements, no livestock packed together, no epidemics. Then, around 12,000 years ago, people started planting seeds: wheat in the Middle East, rice in China, maize in Mexico. Agriculture was invented at least 7 times in completely separate parts of the world, and we've always treated this as the great turning point, the moment humanity took control. Here's where it gets strange. And researchers dug up skeletons from communities that made the switch from foraging to farming. The bones told a different story. Farmers had 50% more signs of malnutrition than their foraging ancestors. Iron deficiency jumped 4-fold. Bone lesions from infectious disease tripled. Life expectancy at birth dropped from 26 years to 19. This wasn't one community. A review examining populations across 5 continents over thousands of years found the same pattern everywhere. When people switched to farming, they got shorter, sicker, and died younger. European men in the Stone Age averaged about 5 feet 10 inches tall. After farming took hold, that dropped to 5 feet 5. It stayed there for 10,000 years. It took until the 20th century to get back to where we started. So if farming was making people's lives worse, why did anyone do it? Nobody decided to become a farmer. It crept up on them. A group camps near a wild wheat patch. Some grains spill, they sprout. Next season, there's a little more wheat nearby. People start staying a few extra weeks during harvest. They scatter a few seeds. Over generations, the camps become semi-permanent, then permanent. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. Children started being born closer together because mothers no longer had to carry toddlers across long distances. More children meant more mouths to feed. More mouths meant more land cleared. More land meant more labor. Each generation inherited a slightly worse deal than the last, but each step was too small for anyone to notice. Harari calls this the luxury trap, a series of small improvements, each one meant to make life a little easier, that locked humanity into a system of endless work. And by the time anyone could have stepped back and seen the full picture, it was too late. The population had grown too large to go back to foraging. The wild game was gone. The knowledge of how to live off the land was fading. Farming also created something that had barely existed before: inequality. Hunter-gatherer groups were remarkably equal. Everyone foraged, everyone shared. There was no surplus to hoard. But once you have stored grain, you have something worth stealing, something worth guarding, something worth fighting over. The people who controlled the food supply became elites. Everyone else became laborers. Skeletons from ancient Greece around 1500, before the Common Era, show that royal remains were 2 to 3 inches taller than commoner remains from the same period. Same village, same time, completely different lives. And then there's wheat itself. 10,000 years ago, it was a wild grass in a small corner of the Middle East. Today it covers over 215 million hectares, an area roughly the size of Greenland. By any biological measure, wheat is one of the most successful organisms on the planet. But think about what it took to get there. Humans cleared rocks from its fields, hauled water to it, pulled competing plants out of its way, stood guard against pests, spent entire days bent over in the sun, working for the wheat. The word domesticate comes from the Latin word for house. The wheat isn't the one living in a house. We didn't domesticate wheat, wheat domesticated us. Now, none of this means civilization was a mistake. Dense populations eventually produced writing, mathematics, medicine, and everything else we'd call progress. The same conditions that made people shorter and sicker also made it possible for someone to sit down and write a best-selling book about how terrible those conditions were. But at the individual level, the evidence is hard to argue with. The average farmer worked longer hours, ate a worse diet, got sick more often, and died younger than the average person who came before them. We didn't choose this. We stumbled into it, one small step at a time, across hundreds of generations. And by the time the full cost became visible, the door behind us had already closed. The wheat one,